Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a podcast and video series where the two of us clowns talk about designing better miniature games. Now, I should say who I am. My name's Mike Hutchinson. I've designed some miniature games. You can purchase them from such esteemed publishers as Offspray Publishing. Glenn has also made some games, both miniature and board and card games. You can find him on Kickstarter under the moniker of Man O'Kent Games. Look up his fine products and patronize him, as I will now.
Is that the word you meant?
Patronize?
Yeah, I think yeah. I think there's
sign up to his Patreon.
Okay, please do, Mike.
It's a bit of a rough start to this conversation. What we're going to talk about here is a subject that is absolutely critical and important to all war games, but doesn't get a huge amount of love. I'm indeed talking about terrain rules, and I think we're going to get even more specific because I've currently been wrestling with a particular kind of terrain rule, and I can feel it in the air. I'm pretty sure Glenn has a rant stored up on this one. It's the topic of rough terrain, which is something that you find in lots of miniature games. Miniature games tend to have miniatures that are moving, and those movements are measured in inches. And you normally get a number of inches, and you can move that number of inches, except when you go through rough terrain, where it doubles the expenditure or halves the movement speed, or however it's worded, thus that you get your tape measure out and you start to calculate half inches and maybe even quarter inches and worry about whether or not you had quite enough to get that extra 3.5 inches over the wood, and whether the back of your base is dragged out over the back of it, or whether you've got enough to clear it completely, etc., etc. Anyway, absolutely fascinating and fabulous use of everyone's wargaming time. Glenn, what could possibly be wrong with rough terrain?
Oh God, it's such a foul and rancid rule, and it's permeated so just deeply into every rule set ever. It horrifies and offends me.
And I hope you've got a solution for how to improve life.
I mean,
but first, tell me what the problems are. We don't want to know what the solutions are. Describe the problem.
I mean, look, okay. Before launching into a full-on rough terrain rant, I just want to take just a second to say, we've been talking a little bit about strategy.
I've met lots of rough terrain that I perfectly enjoyed spending time with.
We've been talking a little bit about abstraction in some of these conversations, and it is worth mentioning that of all the things that get abstracted weirdly on the tabletop, terrain, and particularly rough terrain, is one of the weirdest and one of the most heavily abstracted. I mean, forests, for example, right? In true line of sight games, forests always all block line of sight. No tabletop forest has ever blocked line of sight to literally anything behind it. They just don't. They're like 3 trees stuck onto a section this big. And unless you're fighting the matchstick men of Standard Alinonia, then
comment below if you have played with a correctly represented true line of sight forest.
I mean, I imagine such things could theoretically exist, but they generally don't. But we all agree, even in true line of sight games, that forests block line of sight, even though I can very, very easily see your unit on the other side of that forest. Also, the way that things move through forests. So, okay, on to rough terrain. The standardized rule for rough terrain is that you halve your movement rate going through it. And it's so ubiquitous that it's one of these rules that you could just glaze over as you're going past it. And the thing of it is, first of all, I don't think anybody has ever seen that rule and been happy or excited to engage with it. I don't think anybody's ever read that rule and gone, oh, this is going to be deliciously interesting and crunchy and throw up interesting tactical situations on the tabletop. I think that every time everybody reads that rule, they go, right, fine, you haven't really bothered, have you? I mean, that'll do, and I know it already, so it will save me time, but you haven't really put the effort in. Secondly, I think it's wildly unrealistic. I mean, I've walked through plenty of forests, they do not halve my movement rate. The level of broken terrain that the ground would have to be before I literally walked at half the speed I was walking. And I'm not really trying very hard to walk. I'm not like under pressure and, you know, trying to half run at various points. It's just ridiculous to say that, you know, difficult terrain halves your movement speed. It's a bizarre situation. It's like I could climb over rocks at about half my movement speed in when walking swiftly. And the idea that, oh, it's a ranked up unit of men or a squad of men that have to keep coherency, and so small twigs are much more of a problem when you're trying to keep coherency of the guy next to you. I've also been out on walks in forests with, you know, military attachments. I've been for walks in forests with large groups of people. I have not significantly struggled to keep coherency with those people when going through a forest, not to the point that I'm moving, you know, try walking at half your normal speed. It's really slow. Okay, you know. And the other thing is, even if it was incredibly realistic, even if it was the first time you ever come up with that rule, it's just an absolute grinding unpleasantness to engage with on the tabletop. It just sucks fun out of the game like a big old fun sink that someone's yanked the plug out of. You know, most people when they see that rule go, rough terrain is impassable terrain. And I just will not touch rough terrain with a 50-foot barge pole. It just isn't worth the effort. As soon as you go into it, oh, and God forbid if the rough terrain halves your movement and stops you from marching or stops you from double movement. It's just, oh my God, this is just an absolute horror show if you've got into rough terrain and you're just like, oh no. And it's one of the legendary Warhammer Fantasy Battle Tournament armies was the what used to get referred to as the Wood Elf Taxi Service, which was a Wood Elf army where the entire army got itself into woods and then like scooted the woods around and charged through woods to get you. And oh Lord in heaven, going in after Wood Elves in a forest is just an unpleasantness. It's just horrible. And it's just, I don't know why one of the most ubiquitous rules about one of the most ubiquitous table features is just unfun and unpleasant, and to such a degree that unless something incredibly tactically juicy has been set up, you just don't touch it. Or if the rough terrain is like that thick, so it adds like half an inch onto your movement, any rough terrain that costs you close to one actual turn of movement, it's impassable. Stuff it. I'm not touching it. I'm not going near it. It's not worth the effort. So I don't know why this rule that is just unfun, I would argue unrealistic, uninteresting, tactically dull, you know, is in there. I quite want for rough terrain that offers interesting tactical options on the tabletop. You know, I agree that a ranked up...
You'd rather conveyor belts than swamps.
Okay, I mean, so in relation to things that can be of interest, so you know, I've seen rough terrain rules where certain troops that go through rough terrain might suffer wounds going through that rough terrain, and usually it's like chariots or you know, cavalry at a run. If we accept that wounds are abstractions, and we accept that sometimes a wound represents somebody just filtering off from the unit because they're afraid, they can filter off from the unit because they're lost, because they're going through, you know, a dense forest and they go down the wrong sort of path and they get loose. Why can't every unit go through a forest at the same rate we'd normally do, but it takes wounds, you know, for X many inches going through rough terrain? And then if you're on the other side of the rough terrain, there's a genuine decision for me to make. There's a genuine calculation where I'm going to go, oh, okay, can I afford that many wounds in order to come through in a sort of slightly unexpected angle? With halving your movement, there is nothing unexpected. The other guy knows exactly how long it's going to take you to get through that rough terrain. It is a zero risk for him anchoring his flank on it for a single turn. With something like wounds, with something like it's a bit bookkeepy and a bit faddy, but different rates of slowdown as you're going through the difficult terrain. There are decisions, there are risks, there are options. These are the things we should always be hunting for, I think, in rules. And I think that, as you say, terrain is such an unloved bit of the rules sort of writing. And it's such an important part of the tabletop. Half the point of these sort of non-discrete games where you've got miniatures and you move them around the tabletop and you've got actual terrain that you actually look through and then you actually move through, is that terrain, is the impact it has on the game. And there's nothing sadder than when I see a collection of terrain that may as well just be house bricks. They're just house bricks I drop around the tabletop, and they block movement and they block line of sight, which are worthwhile tactical and strategic things. But these are some of the biggest, most expensive, most detailed minis that the average gamer owns. It is the most grinding thing to actually paint. The number of people who own unpainted terrain, I suspect, is high.
I actually have a better success rate on painting terrain than many armies, but yeah, I take the point.
It's a heavy,
get a very big dry brush.
It's a house brush, dry brush job going on there. I don't think there's going in with a fine detail brush. I just think, paying off, the terrain collection, paying off something that's I think it's a hobby argument to pay off a thing that's a grind to own and collect and put into the tabletop. I think it's a game design argument that it's a wealth of interesting options. And I think it's just, don't do rough terrain halving your movement. It's just horrible. Nobody has ever enjoyed rough terrain halving their movement, ever. The most it ever gets engaged with is where you can cross it in a single turn, and it's just, well, that was the terrain I happened to put onto the tabletop. It's an irritant, but that's the terrain we've got. So deal with it.
So it sounds like one of the things that terrain is supposed to be doing. There's a few things it's supposed to be doing. One is, theater of the mind, it's happening in an actual place that isn't just a featureless plane. So let's have something that describes what's going on. But the other is, of course, that from a purely schematic point of view, it's trying to change the way that force can be projected, or through which corridors units can arrive and so forth. And so certainly something that changes the movement rate of something on paper, that's it's changing the flow of energy around the table. But you're right to say that where something is halving a movement, you're basically saying, well, you can have half as much fun in this area of the table as you can in other places, rather than the slightly weirdly obvious option, which hasn't occurred to me until now, which is, what if you sort of say, well, everything's a bit sludgy and muddy, and so the normal movement rate for everyone, which is their 4 inches or their 8 inches or whatever the game said it is, that's the rough terrain movement. The floor is lava everywhere, except for on these bridges or roads where you get some more movement because they can finally stomp their boots out and actually get some pace up. So maybe a better thing is open terrain, which is actually as rare as rough terrain in a normal game, but it adds 50% to your movement or something.
Yeah. If you're asking somebody to engage with a set of rules that are something other than standard, I think they should add fun and or interest. I think that rough terrain rules as they stand do neither. I think we've got perfectly good impassable terrain rules, and impassable terrain is super important. It's important to give people the option to anchor their flanks on various things, to control movement in the tabletop, etc., etc. And you've got sight blocking terrain, which is super important for fire lines and all those sorts of things. Why is rough terrain this rule that people generally don't engage with? People generally avoid rough terrain, because it makes you so predictable. You can't, once you enter into going half movement, you're totally committed, because you can't back out again, because then you're going quarter movement or some other junk like that.
Mhm.
So you enter into rough terrain, it makes you incredibly obvious to the opponent, it makes you slow enough that he can crawl on his hands and knees away from where you're going to pop out from the rough terrain. And usually what they do is they sit there for a turn or two and then they wheel around as you pop out and go, of course you're not going to hit me in the flank. This isn't reality, wherein it's worth going through the forest because they don't see you coming and they don't expect you. We have perfect knowledge in our world. And I think one of the things is that there's this time to go, okay, in the real world, we will simulate the fact that forests would slow you down, but people still went into forests because they got people by surprise. And it's like, well, if you're not simulating the surprise, don't simulate the slowdown. And you're not simulating the surprise because I can see you, I saw you go into that forest, I'll calculate exactly how long it'll take you to get out. I've got a couple of jobs going on, and then when I'm done with those jobs, I'll wheel around and you'll run into my front and you'll go, I'm never going in a forest again, because that's what people generally do after they've been into a forest once in one of these games, and they're so open to people exploiting you. The number of games where you can't go within 1 inch of a person unless you charge, and you can't charge someone unless you can see them, and forests mean you can't see more than 2 inches, so one man stands in the forest 2 inches in front of you and you move to 1 inch of him and he takes an inch step backwards, and that happens for the rest of your entire life. It's like when a really nasty player has done that to you once, you'll want all rough terrain rules to be burnt at the stake. Yeah, and I just think, look into ways that these terrain rules can excite people when they look at them. I mean, so we're bringing this up because the rough terrain rules in Hobgoblin have rolled through a couple of iterations. And there was an iteration that I think was quite interesting, where you paid movement to enter into it, but had a problem with the fact that you could prepay all of your movement points before doing any moving, and then you could just blast through rough terrain and it didn't touch you. And I feel like I'm sad that I beat you down, or other people have beat you down on that rough terrain rule, because you've temporarily done a change to it. I'm hoping it's temporary.
Yeah, but the way that I'd written the rough terrain rule was to match some earlier terrain rules, and it basically was the normal rough terrain rule. It just was a funky way of writing it because I was experimenting with a sort of strange movement point expenditure system, which will probably still end up in there. It's just that there was an easier way to write it, and I chose to write it in a difficult way. And then when I made a change to the charge rules to fix something else, it had an unintended consequence.
Yeah. So, and I think you've currently defaulted to the standard rough terrain rule, which
So gentle listener, the game that we most recently played together, Glenn and I was experimenting with some movement rules. One of those was adding the default rough terrain rules, and in order to test that, we put rough terrain almost everywhere on the table in order to maximize our enjoyment and make sure that we experienced it. And it was really obvious. It was really obvious that once you put enough rough terrain down, it really cramped the game and created these corridors, which could have been created using impassable terrain. But I still think that there was something going on where it's like, well, now I'm forced to go through here and there's a disadvantage. But at no point was it fun. It was removing fun from the game, sponging it up. It was definitely doing something. And so the question is, well, can you create that tactical interest but make it seem exciting? And turning it on its head is the most obvious first choice I can think of, but there's no doubt other ones as well.
Yeah, that's the thing. Corridors and choke points on the tabletop are interesting, but if you create them with impassable terrain, you're just creating them. If you're creating them with rough terrain, that rough terrain rule, you're creating them with fun punishments, and you go
right. And so the question is,
because not going to the corridor is going to be unfun.
And so impassable terrain is in some ways boring because there's no optionality around it. And so is there a version of rough terrain which, like your Doom version or like my ice skating version, is there a version of terrain corridoring where you still have optionality, but it's a payment that you have to make, and you can still have fun, but it's like it's fun plus a punishment rather than just taking fun away.
Exactly.
It's fun plus a resource cost.
Exactly. Okay, so a large part of that conversation has been me having a prolonged rant about rough terrain. Not rough terrain, but the standardized rough terrain rule that I feel like I see in 90% of games. And maybe we're going to come up with a more intelligent and more interactive and more fun version of a rough terrain rule. So if you would like to see if we've managed that, why not stop by the Hobgoblin Discord, where any such rules and iterations and intelligent thoughts will be offered to the splendid beta test group that you...
Yeah, so you type Hobgoblin open beta into your search engine of choice. I hope that will throw it up. If not, head over to planetsmashergames.com/hobgoblin. You'll find details and links there. If you are a Discord naysayer, then you will find us also on the Great and Glorious Facebook. All praise our masters and overlords. And yeah, I'd be really interested particularly if you have played fantasy rank and file games before, what you make of it. Particularly if you haven't played any rank and file games at all before, I'm super interested to hear what you make of it. So yeah, come and throw peanuts at me from the gallery.
Absolutely. Drop if you've seen a rough terrain rule that isn't my most hated rule. It's not my most hated rule, as so many rules that I'm a full is one of my more disliked rules. Drop that rough terrain rule into the comment section.
There's a bunch of other rules cowering in the green room going, when will we be summoned for our punishment?
Drop a good rough terrain rule into the comments section. We might need something to steal by the time this video rolls out. Sure that we'll have intelligent comments to make on other rough terrain rules. Look us up on social media. Hammer the like and subscribe buttons wherever you
break it. Just like see if you can break it. I mean, I haven't tried, but just go for it.
I'm sure.
Unfortunately, that's only a 50-50 chance if we end up with a like at that point. But
yeah, break it an odd number of times. But yeah, from this episode of Rule of Carnage, it's going to be thank you and goodbye. So thank you and goodbye.